What if one of NATO's most important new military powers is not a massive country like the United States, Britain, or Germany, but a quiet Nordic nation that spent 2 centuries avoiding military alliances? That country is Sweden. For more than 200 years, Sweden was famous for neutrality. It stayed out of major wars, balanced between great powers, and built its military around one idea: defend the homeland, but do not get dragged into someone else's war. But that era is over. Sweden is now inside NATO. Russia's war in Ukraine has changed the security map of Europe, and Stockholm is no longer thinking like a neutral state. It is thinking like a front-line NATO power. So the real question is not simply how strong is Sweden's military. The real question is, what does Sweden bring to NATO at the exact moment Europe is preparing for the possibility of a wider confrontation with Russia? And the answer is much bigger than most people realize.
To understand Sweden today, we need to look at its past. Many people think of Sweden as peaceful, neutral, and quiet. But historically, Sweden was once a serious European military power. In the 17th century, Sweden fought across the Baltic region, Germany, Poland, and Northern Europe. At its peak, the Baltic Sea almost looked like a Swedish lake. But over time, that empire declined. Russia rose. Sweden lost Finland. And after the Napoleonic era, Sweden made a major strategic choice: neutrality. But this was not weak neutrality. This was armed neutrality. Sweden understood something very clearly. If you are neutral but weak, neutrality is only a slogan. If you are neutral and heavily armed, then neutrality becomes a strategy. That is why Sweden built a citizen-based defense system, invested in conscription, coastal defense, aircraft, submarines, and its own defense industry. Sweden did not want to depend completely on foreign suppliers. It wanted weapons designed for Swedish geography, Swedish roads, Swedish forests, Swedish islands, and Swedish weather. This is why Sweden produced aircraft like the Draken, Viggen, and later the Gripen. It is why Swedish submarines became famous for quiet operations in shallow waters. It is why Swedish armored vehicles like the CV-90 earned international respect. So when people ask, does Sweden have a serious military tradition? The answer is yes. Sweden may have been neutral, but it was never careless.
After the Cold War ended, Sweden, like many European countries, reduced its military. Defense budgets went down. Conscription was suspended. The armed forces became smaller and more focused on international missions rather than homeland defense. At that time, many European governments believed major war in Europe was unlikely. Then came 2014. Russia seized Crimea and war began in eastern Ukraine. For Sweden, that was the first alarm bell. Then came 2022. Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That was the moment the old European security order collapsed. For Sweden, the lesson was direct. Russia was not just a distant problem. Russia was once again the central security threat in Northern Europe. This pushed Sweden to make one of the biggest strategic decisions in its modern history, abandoning its long tradition of military non-alignment and joining NATO. And this changes everything. Sweden is not just defending Sweden anymore. Sweden is now part of NATO's collective defense system. That means Swedish territory, Swedish airspace, Swedish ports, Swedish submarines, Swedish aircraft, and Swedish intelligence now become part of NATO's northern military architecture.
Sweden's geography is extremely important. Look at the map. Sweden sits between Norway, Finland, Denmark, the Baltic Sea, and the Arctic region. It connects NATO's northern flank with the Baltic states. It strengthens the defense of Finland. It helps protect sea routes. And most importantly, it gives NATO greater depth in the Baltic region. One location matters more than almost any other: Gotland. Gotland is a Swedish island in the Baltic Sea.
In military terms, it is like a giant observation post and launch point in the middle of the Baltic. Whoever controls Gotland can monitor and influence movement across the region. During the post-Cold War years, Sweden reduced its military presence there. But after Russia's actions in Ukraine, Sweden reversed that decision. Gotland has been remilitarized, and today it is one of the most strategically important points in Northern Europe. For NATO, Sweden makes the Baltic Sea much harder for Russia to operate in freely. With Finland and Sweden both inside NATO, Russia's position in the Baltic region has become much more complicated. This is why Sweden's NATO membership is not symbolic. It changes the military map.
Now, let's talk about the actual military. Sweden's army is not huge, but it is becoming more powerful, more modern, and more NATO integrated. The Swedish army is built around quality. It uses advanced tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, artillery, air defense, and highly trained troops. Sweden has Leopard 2 base tanks, and it is now moving forward with new Leopard 2 A8 purchases and modernization of its existing tank fleet. It also operates the CV-90 infantry fighting vehicle, one of the most respected armored vehicles in Europe. The CV-90 has gained even more attention because of its role in Ukraine, where modern infantry fighting vehicles have proven how important mobility, protection, and firepower are on today's battlefield. Then there is the Archer artillery system. This is one of Sweden's most famous modern weapons. It is mobile, fast, accurate, and designed for shoot-and-scoot operations. In a war where drones, counter-battery fire, and precision strikes dominate the battlefield, that kind of artillery matters. Sweden's Air Force is built around the Gripen fighter jet. The Gripen is not designed to be a giant prestige aircraft. It is designed for survival, flexibility, and operations from dispersed locations, including road bases. That is very important because in a real war, major air bases may be targeted early. So Sweden's idea is simple. Do not put all your aircraft in one vulnerable place. Spread them out. Keep them moving. Keep them flying. That approach feels more relevant today than ever. Sweden is also investing in airborne surveillance through advanced early warning aircraft. In modern war, seeing first often means surviving first. Airborne radar, electronic intelligence, and command and control aircraft are not glamorous, but they can decide the outcome of air and naval operations. The Swedish Navy is small, but very specialized. It focuses on submarines, corvettes, patrol boats, and coastal defense. Sweden does not need a giant blue water navy like the United States. Its mission is different. Control difficult waters, defend the coast, threaten enemy ships, and operate in the Baltic Sea's shallow and complex environment. This is where Sweden's diesel-electric submarines become extremely valuable. In narrow seas, a quiet submarine can be a nightmare for any larger navy.
One of the most important ideas in Sweden's defense strategy is called total defense. This means defense is not only about soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. It includes civil defense, emergency stockpiles, shelters, food security, cyber defense, infrastructure, hospitals, communication networks, and public preparedness. Sweden understands that modern warfare is not only fought on the battlefield. It is fought through cyber attacks, sabotage, disinformation, energy pressure, attacks on infrastructure, and psychological operations. Russia's war against Ukraine has shown this clearly. So Sweden is preparing not only its armed forces, but its society. That is what makes the Swedish model interesting. It is not just military modernization, it is national resilience.
Now comes the big question. Is Sweden's military large enough? The honest answer is, Sweden is not a massive military power. It cannot fight Russia alone. Its army is still relatively small compared with major European powers. Its navy is compact. Its air force is capable, but not enormous. But that is not the correct way to measure Sweden anymore. Sweden is now part of NATO. Its job is not to defeat Russia alone.
Its job is to strengthen NATO's northern flank, defend key territory, provide high-quality forces, secure the Baltic region, support Finland and the Baltic states, and make any Russian attack much more costly. And in that role, Sweden is extremely valuable. Sweden brings advanced technology, strong geography, a serious defense industry, trained forces, submarines, Gripen fighters, artillery, armored vehicles, and a society that is relearning how to prepare for crisis. In other words, Sweden does not need to be the biggest military in Europe. It needs to be a sharp, modern, difficult-to-defeat military in exactly the right location. And that is what it is becoming. Sweden's story is one of the biggest strategic shifts in Europe. For 2 centuries, Sweden tried to stay outside military alliances. Today, it is inside NATO, increasing defense spending, rebuilding its armed forces, strengthening Gotland, modernizing tanks and aircraft, expanding civil defense, and preparing for a much more dangerous Europe. This is not the old Sweden of quiet neutrality. This is a Sweden that sees the threat clearly, a Sweden that understands geography, a Sweden that knows the Baltic Sea, the Arctic, and Northern Europe are now central to NATO's future. And if a crisis ever comes, Sweden may not be the loudest power in the alliance, but it could become one of the most important. Because in the new Europe, Sweden is no longer sitting on the sidelines. Sweden is becoming NATO's northern shield.